Mom, we think it's time you moved somewhere safer, Ashley said, sliding the glossy brochure across the table like it was just another dinner menu, like it belonged there between the roasted chicken and the green beans I had spent all afternoon preparing, and for a moment I simply looked at it, at the soft blue cover with smiling gray-haired couples walking along a perfectly landscaped path. The words "Comfort Living Senior Community" printed in elegant gold lettering, and I felt something shift quietly inside me, not break, not shatter, just settle into place, the way a puzzle piece finally clicks after you've been forcing it in the wrong spot for far too long. And I smiled, because that's what I've always done. I smiled and picked it up carefully, smoothing the edge with my thumb as if it were something delicate, something worth preserving, even as I felt Daniel watching me from across the table, his eyes flicking up and then away too quickly, the same way he used to look when he was a boy and knew he'd done something wrong but didn't want to admit it, except now he was 42 years old and sitting in the house I had paid off 20 years ago, the house his father and I had built together inch by inch, paycheck by paycheck, long before Ashley ever stepped foot into our lives with her polished smile and that careful, measured tone she used when she wanted something. It's really a wonderful place, she continued, her voice soft, almost rehearsed. They have full time staff, activities, everything you could need, and I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it, as if this were a thoughtful gift and not a quiet eviction notice wrapped in polite language, and around us the dining room felt strangely distant, the candles I had lit flickering gently, their reflections dancing against the glass cabinet filled with dishes I only brought out for special occasions like this one, my 68th birthday, a night I had imagined differently in 100 small ways, none of which included being handed a brochure for where I was apparently supposed to go when I was no longer convenient. You wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore, Daniel added. Finally, his voice careful, neutral, like he was discussing a business decision rather than his own mother's life, and I looked at him then, really looked, at the man who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, who used to call me every Sunday without fail, who used to say, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom," and I wondered when exactly that version of him had disappeared, or if I had simply chosen not to notice the slow, steady way he had been stepping back, letting someone else take the lead, letting someone else decide what was best for me, for all of us, and I realized, sitting there with that brochure in my hands, that this hadn't started tonight, it hadn't started with this dinner or even with Ashley, it had been building quietly for years in the spaces between conversations, in the decisions I was no longer included in the way my opinions had become suggestions, and my suggestions had become interruptions, and my interruptions had become silence. And I had allowed it, piece by piece, because I believed that love meant making room, meant stepping aside when needed, meant trusting that family would always circle back, but now, as I traced the edge of that brochure, I understood something I should have understood much sooner, that sometimes when you step aside, people don't circle back, they move forward without you, and they call it progress. What do you think? Ashley asked, tilting her head slightly, studying my face with that same careful attention she used when negotiating anything important, and I met her eyes, really met them this time, and I saw it clearly, not cruelty, not even anger, just calculation, a quiet certainty that this was already decided, that this conversation was simply a formality, a box to be checked before the next step, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, deeper than anything I had felt all evening, deeper than the initial sting, deeper than the disappointment, something steadier, something clearer. "I think it looks very nice," I said, my voice even, almost warm, and I saw the smallest flicker of relief pass between them, a glance exchanged, quick but unmistakable, as if they had been bracing for resistance, for tears, for something messy and inconvenient, and instead I had given them exactly what they wanted, compliance, and I set the brochure down beside my plate, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table, the way I always did with everything, because order had always been my way of keeping control, even when everything else felt uncertain, and I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to believe the moment had passed, that the decision had been accepted, that the path ahead was clear, and then I folded my hands in my lap, my fingers still, my posture relaxed, and I smiled again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, because in that quiet, unremarkable moment, as the candles flickered and the room settled back into its careful stillness, I had already decided what I was going to do next, and they had no idea. I did not touch the brochure again for the rest of the dinner, not because I had forgotten it was there, but because I wanted them to believe I had accepted it, that it had already settled into my future the way they had planned, and the conversation slowly drifted back to safe, ordinary things. Ashley talking about a new yoga studio opening downtown, Daniel mentioning a client he had been trying to close for weeks, their voices blending together in a calm, practiced rhythm that felt strangely detached from the moment that had just passed, and I listened, nodding when expected, smiling at the right times, the same way I had done for years, except now I was hearing something different beneath their words, something quieter but far more revealing, the absence of me in every plan they described, every decision already made without a single question directed in my direction. And I realized that this dinner was not an isolated moment, it was simply the first time they had said it out loud. The first time they had placed it directly in front of me in a form I could not ignore, and I felt a flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel before, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop trying to explain other people's behavior in ways that protect them, and instead you begin to see it exactly as it is. Daniel reached for the wine bottle and poured himself another glass, not offering me any, not noticing that my glass had been empty for the past 10 minutes. And it was such a small thing, so ordinary that no one else would have thought twice about it, but I noticed, because I had always noticed everything, every shift, every change, every quiet adjustment that told the real story behind the polite surface. And as I watched him laugh softly at something Ashley said, I remembered the last time he had asked me if I wanted another drink. It had been years ago, before Ashley had started making decisions for both of them, before my role had been reduced to something optional. Something they could include or exclude depending on what was convenient. We just want what is best for you, Ashley said again at one point, her tone gentle, reassuring, the same tone she had used earlier, as if repeating it would make it true, and I nodded once more, because arguing would have served no purpose, because explaining how wrong she was would not have changed anything, and because, for the first time, I did not feel the need to convince them of anything at all. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was simply observing, storing every word, every glance, every decision, the way I used to when Daniel was a child and I needed to understand what he was not saying, except now the stakes were different. Now it was not about guiding him, it was about protecting myself, and that realization settled into me with a steady, unshakable weight. When dinner finally ended, Ashley stood and began clearing plates with quick, efficient movements, not asking for help, not offering me the chance to participate, as if I were already a guest in my own home, as if my presence in the kitchen was no longer expected, and I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly on the table, taking in the room I knew so well, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the faint scent of the candles still burning low, and I let myself feel it fully, not the loss of the house itself, but the loss of the place I had held within it, the role I had played for so many years, the certainty I had once had about where I belonged. And then I stood slowly, smoothing my dress as I did, and walked to the kitchen doorway, where Ashley was rinsing dishes under warm water, her back to me, her posture relaxed in a way that told me she believed everything had gone exactly as planned. "Thank you for dinner," she said over her shoulder without turning around, as if she were the host and I were the guest, and I smiled again, because that, too, told me everything I needed to know. "You are welcome," I replied, my voice calm, steady, and I stepped past her to the drawer where I kept the household documents, opening it just enough to slip my hand inside, my fingers brushing against the familiar stack of papers I had organized months ago, long before tonight, long before the brochure, back when I had first begun to notice the subtle shifts I could no longer ignore, and I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle over me, the kind that does not need to be announced or explained, the kind that simply exists, waiting for the right moment. I closed the drawer gently and turned back toward the dining room, where Daniel was checking his phone, already half distracted, already moving on, and I realized that they believed this was the end of something, the closing of a chapter where I would quietly step aside and let them take control. But as I walked back into that room, past the flickering candles and the neatly folded brochure resting exactly where I had left it, I understood with absolute clarity that this was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of something they had not even considered, something they would not see coming until it was far too late. That night, after they left, the house felt different, not emptier, but quieter in a way that allowed me to finally hear my own thoughts without interruption, without the soft influence of someone else's expectations pressing against them, and I moved slowly through each room, turning off lights one by one, my hand lingering on each switch just a second longer than usual, as if I were marking something, not an ending, but a transition, and when I reached the living room, I paused, looking at the photographs lined along the mantel, Daniel at 8 years old with a gap-toothed smile, Daniel at 16 holding his driver's license like it was a trophy, Daniel on his wedding day, standing beside Ashley with that same uncertain smile he had worn earlier that evening, and I studied that photo for a moment, noticing something I had overlooked before, the way Ashley stood just slightly ahead of him, her hand resting lightly but firmly on his arm, as if guiding him into place, and I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper, confirming what I had begun to understand, that this had never been sudden, it had been gradual, deliberate, a series of small adjustments that had led us exactly here. I turned away from the mantel and walked to the desk in the corner, the one my husband had used for years, the one I had kept exactly as it was after he passed, not out of sentimentality, but because it reminded me of something important, that stability comes from consistency, from knowing what belongs to you and what does not, and I opened the top drawer, pulling out a folder I had placed there weeks ago, a simple manila folder, nothing remarkable about it except for what it contained, and I set it on the desk, opening it carefully, reviewing each document with steady eyes, not because I needed to read them again, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the decision I had already made, the signatures, the dates, the conditions written in clear, precise language that left no room for interpretation. I had not created these documents in response to tonight, I had prepared them long before, back when the signs had first begun to appear, back when I realized that waiting for things to improve was no longer a plan, it was a risk. And I had decided then that I would not leave my future in someone else's hands, no matter who they were. I closed the folder and rested my palm on top of it for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of control settle in, the kind that does not come from force or confrontation, but from preparation, from understanding exactly where you stand and what you are willing to accept, and what you are not. The next morning, I woke up at my usual time, 6:30, the soft light of early morning filtering through the curtains, and for a moment everything felt the same as it always had, the familiar rhythm of my routine waiting to be followed, but there was something different beneath it, something steadier, something resolved, and I moved through my morning without hesitation, making coffee, setting the cup on the same spot at the kitchen table where I had sat for years, but this time I did not linger, I did not allow my thoughts to drift into uncertainty. Instead I stood, walked back to the drawer, and took out the folder once more, placing it into my bag with a calm, deliberate motion, and as I did, I thought of Ashley's voice from the night before, the careful way she had presented that brochure, the assumption behind it, the quiet certainty that I would follow the path they had outlined for me, and I almost smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of understanding, because they had underestimated something essential, not my strength, not my resilience, but my awareness. They had assumed I was unaware of the shift, unaware of the intention behind their actions, unaware of the way decisions had been made around me instead of with me, and that assumption had given me time to prepare, time to think, time to act without pressure. And now that time had run its course, I picked up my keys from the counter, the familiar weight settling into my hand, and walked toward the front door, pausing just long enough to glance back at the kitchen, at the table where we had sat together the night before, where everything had been laid out so neatly, so carefully, as if it were the final step in a plan they believed was already complete, and I understood then that while they had been planning my exit, I had been planning something entirely different, something they would not recognize until it was already in motion. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool morning air, closing it gently behind me, not as someone leaving, but as someone moving forward with purpose, with clarity, with a decision that had already been made long before anyone else realized there was a choice to be made at all. I drove across town just after 7 in the morning, the streets still quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every decision feel louder in your own mind, and I kept both hands steady on the wheel, not because I was nervous, but because I understood that this moment required precision, not emotion. And when I pulled into the small parking lot of Harrison Legal Group, I noticed how unchanged it all looked, the same brick building, the same modest sign near the entrance, the same row of neatly trimmed hedges lining the walkway, and for a brief second, I was taken back to years ago, when I had first walked into this office beside my husband, his hand resting lightly on my back as if to reassure me that everything we were about to sign was simply part of securing our future, and now here I was again, alone, but not uncertain, not hesitant, just aware of how much had changed and how much had remained exactly the same. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeting me, and the receptionist looked up with a polite smile that softened into recognition. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a while," she said, and I nodded, returning the smile without offering more, because this was not a visit that required conversation, it required action, and a few minutes later, I was seated across from Mr. Harrison, who looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner, his posture slightly more reserved, but his eyes still sharp, still attentive in a way that told me he understood far more than people ever said out loud. "I had a feeling you might come in today," he said quietly, folding his hands on the desk, and I met his gaze, not surprised, because I suspected he had seen this pattern before, not my exact situation, but enough like it to recognize the signs. "They gave me something last night," I said, placing the brochure on the desk between us, its glossy surface catching the light in a way that made it seem almost cheerful, and he glanced at it briefly. Then back at me, his expression unchanged. "And you are ready," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and I nodded once. Because readiness is not something you declare in a moment, it is something you arrive at after a long series of smaller realizations, after enough evidence has gathered that you can no longer pretend things are the same. "I do not want any confusion later," I added, my voice calm, steady. "I want everything clear, documented, and immediate," and he gave a slight nod, already reaching for the folder he had prepared, the one we had discussed weeks ago, back when I first began to notice the quiet shifts that no one else acknowledged, back when I understood that waiting for clarity from others was no longer an option, and as he opened the folder, turning it toward me, I felt no hesitation, no second thoughts, just a quiet sense of alignment between what I knew and what I was about to do. "These documents will transfer control of the estate into a protected trust," he explained, his tone measured, precise. "All assets, including the house, accounts, and any future income, will be managed according to the conditions you specified," and I listened carefully, not because I did not understand, but because I respected the weight of what was being put into motion. This was not a reaction, it was a decision, one that would redefine everything moving forward. "And the clause," I said, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, "it is enforceable." He met my eyes again, a slight firmness in his expression now. "Yes, if any individual attempts to relocate you against your will, or restrict your access to your own property, they will be immediately removed from any benefit under the trust." I let that settle for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because this was the line, the boundary that had been crossed without my consent, the boundary I was now re-establishing in a way that could not be ignored, and I picked up the pen he offered, its weight familiar, almost ordinary, and for a brief second, I thought about the dinner table, the flickering candles, the quiet certainty in Ashley's voice, the way Daniel had avoided my eyes, and I realized something important. They believed they were guiding my future, shaping it into something more convenient, more manageable for them, but they had never considered that I might be doing the same, that I might already be steps ahead, not in conflict, but in preparation, and I signed my name slowly, deliberately, each letter clear, unhurried, because this was not something to rush, this was something to confirm, and when I finished, I set the pen down carefully, sliding the document back toward Mr. Harrison, who reviewed it with a practiced glance before nodding once. "It is done," he said, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper, not relief, not triumph, just a steady awareness that the balance had shifted, not visibly, not yet, but in a way that would become undeniable soon enough. I stood, smoothing my coat as I did, and reached for the brochure, folding it once before placing it back into my bag, not as something I intended to use, but as a reminder of what had prompted this moment, what had revealed the truth I could no longer ignore. And as I walked out of the office, back into the cool morning air, I understood that nothing outward had changed yet. The house would look the same, the conversations would continue as they had, the roles would appear unchanged, but beneath it all, everything was different now, and they would not realize it until they tried to take the next step, until they reached for something they believed was already theirs, and found that it was no longer within their control. When I returned home that morning, everything looked exactly as I had left it, the same quiet kitchen, the same neatly arranged chairs, the same faint scent of last night's dinner still lingering in the air, and for a moment it almost felt as if nothing had happened, as if the conversation, the brochure, the decision I had just signed into place were all something imagined rather than real, but I knew better. Because the difference was not in the house, it was in me, in the way I moved through the space now with a quiet awareness that had not been there before. I set my bag down on the counter and took out the brochure, placing it carefully in the center of the table, not with anger, not with defiance, but with intention, as if it were an object I needed to study, to understand fully, even though I already knew what it represented, and I sat down across from it, folding my hands in front of me, allowing the silence to stretch, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present, and in that silence, memories began to surface, not in a rush, not overwhelming, but one at a time, clear and precise, like pieces of a pattern I could now finally see in full. I remembered the first time Ashley had suggested that I let them handle the bills, her tone light, almost helpful, as if she were offering to take something off my plate, and I had agreed without much thought, trusting that it was simply part of sharing responsibilities. I remembered when Daniel had changed the locks on the back door, explaining it as a security upgrade, handing me a new key with a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and I had accepted it, telling myself it was practical, that I was reading too much into it. I remembered the conversations that slowly stopped including me, the plans made without asking, the subtle way my presence had shifted from central to optional, and as each memory settled into place, I realized that none of this had been sudden, none of it had been accidental, it had been a process, gradual, controlled, carefully framed so that I would not resist, so that I would adjust without noticing the full extent of what was changing, and I had allowed it, not because I was unaware, but because I chose to believe that family meant trust, that intentions were good even when actions felt slightly off. But now, sitting there with that brochure in front of me, I understood that trust without boundaries is not kindness, it is vulnerability, and vulnerability, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes something else entirely. I reached out and opened the brochure, flipping through the pages slowly, taking in the images of neatly made rooms, smiling residents, activities scheduled down to the hour, everything designed to look comforting, controlled, predictable, and I realized that what they were offering me was not care, it was containment, a way to simplify their lives by reducing mine, by placing me somewhere I would no longer interfere with their plans. And the clarity of that realization did not hurt the way I might have expected it to. It did not feel sharp or overwhelming, it felt steady, almost inevitable, like something that had been waiting to be acknowledged, and I closed the brochure gently, aligning it with the edge of the table once more, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of acceptance, not acceptance of what they wanted, but acceptance of what was true, and what I needed to do because of it. Later that afternoon, my phone rang, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, and I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to choose the moment, to meet the conversation on my terms rather than his. "Hi Mom," he said, his voice casual, almost too casual, as if he were testing the tone, trying to determine where I stood without asking directly. "Hi Daniel," I replied, matching his calm. And there was a brief pause, just long enough to reveal that this call had a purpose beyond simple conversation. "We were thinking," he began, and I could almost hear Ashley in the background, not speaking, but present, guiding, shaping the direction of what was about to be said. "Maybe we could go visit that place this weekend, just to take a look," and I smiled, even though he could not see it, because the timing was exactly what I expected, the next step in a plan they believed was unfolding smoothly, and I leaned slightly back in my chair, my gaze resting on the brochure in front of me. "That sounds like a good idea," I said, my voice even, agreeable, and I heard the subtle shift in his breathing, the quiet release of tension, the confirmation that I was cooperating, that everything was proceeding as they had anticipated. "Great," he said quickly, relief evident now, "Ashley will set everything up," and I nodded, even though the gesture was unnecessary, because this was no longer about convincing them of anything, it was about allowing them to continue to move forward exactly as they intended, without interruption, without resistance, because sometimes the clearest way to change the outcome is not to stop the process, but to let it unfold until it reveals itself completely. "I will be ready," I said simply, and when the call ended, I remained seated for a moment longer, my hand resting lightly on the table beside the brochure, and I understood that the next few days would be important, not because I needed more time, but because they would believe they were gaining ground, that each step brought them closer to their goal, and in that belief, they would not see what had already shifted, what had already been set into motion, and I allowed myself one final glance around the room, the space that had held so many years of my life, not with attachment, not with regret, but with a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be decided for me, it would be decided by me, exactly as it should have been all along. Saturday arrived with a kind of quiet precision, the kind that comes when every detail has already been considered long before the moment itself unfolds, and I woke before my alarm, not out of restlessness, but out of readiness, the same steady awareness that had been guiding me all week settling into place once more, and I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately, choosing my clothes with care, not for appearance, but for intention, a soft gray dress, simple, composed, something that reflected exactly how I felt, calm, measured, entirely in control, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see someone being led somewhere she did not want to go, I saw someone who had already decided where she stood, and that difference, though invisible to anyone else, changed everything. Daniel arrived right on time, his car pulling into the driveway at exactly 10 o'clock, as predictable as he had always been, and I watched him step out, adjusting his jacket, glancing briefly at his phone before walking to the door, and when I opened it, he smiled, a little too quickly, a little too carefully. "Morning, Mom," he said, his tone light, as if this were just another ordinary visit, and I returned the smile, stepping aside to let him in. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied, and for a moment we stood there in the entryway, the space between us filled with everything neither of us was saying, and then Ashley's voice called from outside, "Are you ready?" And I turned slightly, seeing her step out of the passenger side, her expression composed, confident, already in motion, and I nodded once, reaching for my bag, the same one that now held far more than they could possibly imagine, and we walked to the car together, the air cool but clear, the sky bright in a way that made everything seem deceptively simple, as if this were just a routine outing, a small step in a logical plan, and I took my seat in the back without hesitation, allowing them to take the front, to maintain the positions they had grown accustomed to, Ashley navigating, Daniel driving, both of them moving forward with the quiet certainty of people who believe they are in control, and as the car pulled away from the house, I glanced briefly out the window, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge the place that had shaped so much of my life, the place they believed I was about to leave behind, and I felt no resistance, no urge to hold on, because I understood something they did not, that leaving is not always about location, sometimes it is about position, about who holds the power to decide, and that had already changed. The drive itself was uneventful, filled with light conversation, Ashley pointing out a new cafe that had opened, Daniel mentioning traffic patterns as if they were discussing something entirely separate from the purpose of the trip, and I responded when appropriate, keeping my voice steady, my expressions measured, giving them exactly what they expected to see, a woman who was compliant, agreeable, ready to consider the next step, and I could feel their confidence growing with each mile, their belief strengthening that this was all going according to plan, and when we finally turned into the entrance of the community, the large sign welcoming visitors with polished lettering and carefully maintained landscaping, Ashley leaned slightly forward, her eyes scanning the buildings with a look of quiet approval. "See, it is beautiful," she said, and I nodded, taking in the wide sidewalks, the neatly arranged flower beds, the identical rows of windows, everything designed to create a sense of comfort, of order, of predictability, and I understood immediately why they had chosen this place, why it made sense to them. It was controlled, contained, efficient, everything my presence in their lives had apparently become not. We parked near the main entrance, and Daniel turned off the engine, glancing back at me with a small, expectant smile. "Ready?" he asked, and I met his eyes, holding his gaze just long enough for him to feel it, though not long enough for him to question it. "Of course," I said, my voice calm, almost reassuring, and we stepped out of the car together, walking toward the building, where a receptionist greeted us warmly, her tone practiced, welcoming, as if she had done this 100 times before, guiding families through this exact moment. And as she began explaining the amenities, the services, the daily routines, I listened carefully, not because I was considering any of it, but because I wanted to understand exactly what they believed they were offering me, what they thought I would accept, and I nodded at the right times, asked a question or two, allowing the process to unfold naturally, smoothly, just as they expected, and all the while, I was aware of something deeper, something beneath the surface of polite conversation and guided tours, a quiet shift that had already taken place, one they could not see yet, one they would not recognize until they tried to finalize what they believed was already decided, and as we moved from room to room, from explanation to explanation, I felt that same steady certainty holding firm, because this was not a visit about choosing a place for me to go, it was a moment that would soon reveal exactly who was truly in control, and they were still walking forward as if nothing had changed. The tour ended in a softly lit office just off the main lobby, where a neatly dressed coordinator sat behind a polished desk with a folder already prepared, as if she had been expecting us long before we walked through the door. And I noticed the way Ashley's posture shifted slightly the moment we entered, a subtle straightening of her shoulders, a quiet readiness that told me this was the part she had been waiting for, the part where everything became official, where suggestion turned into action, and the coordinator smiled warmly, gesturing for us to sit, her tone practiced, reassuring. "We like to make the transition as smooth as possible," she said, sliding the folder forward, her fingers resting lightly on the edge as she spoke. "Most families find it helpful to begin the paperwork early, just to secure availability." And I watched as Ashley leaned in just a fraction, her attention sharpening. Daniel, sitting beside her, quieter now, but present, following her lead in the same way he had all morning, and I took my seat across from them, placing my bag gently at my feet, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged. And as the coordinator began explaining the documents, outlining the terms, the schedules, the commitments, I listened with the same steady focus I had carried since the night of the dinner, not because I needed the information, but because I understood the importance of allowing the moment to unfold exactly as they expected. "If you would like to move forward," the coordinator continued, turning the first page toward us, "we can begin with the initial agreement today." And there it was, the step they had been building toward, the quiet assumption that this was no longer a discussion, but a decision already made, and I felt Ashley's gaze shift toward me, not directly, but enough to register, waiting, measuring, anticipating my response, and I reached forward slowly, my fingers brushing against the paper, tracing the edge just as I had done with the brochure days before, the same controlled, deliberate motion. And I nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried far more meaning than they understood. "It seems very thorough," I said, my voice calm, thoughtful, as if I were carefully considering the details rather than simply acknowledging the structure. And Ashley smiled, a hint of satisfaction softening her expression. "We just want everything to be easy for you," she added, her tone gentle, practiced, and I inclined my head slightly, accepting the words without challenge, without resistance, because this was not the moment to oppose, this was the moment to align, to allow them to believe that everything was proceeding exactly as they intended. The coordinator placed a pen on the desk, sliding it toward me with a polite, expectant smile, and I picked it up, holding it lightly between my fingers, pausing just long enough to create a sense of consideration, of reflection, and I could feel the room settle around that pause, the quiet anticipation, the belief that this was the turning point, that this was the moment I would step fully into the role they had chosen for me. And I lowered my gaze to the document, scanning the lines, not reading, but acknowledging, and then, without hesitation, I set the pen down again, reaching instead for my bag, opening it with a smooth, unhurried motion, and I heard Ashley's breath catch slightly, a small shift in the air that told me something in this moment had not followed the script she had written in her mind, and I withdrew the folder from inside, placing it carefully on the desk beside the coordinator's documents, aligning it neatly before opening it, and for the first time that morning, I allowed a faint change in my expression, not a smile, not a reaction, just a quiet clarity that did not need explanation. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice steady, composed, "there is something that needs to be acknowledged," and I turned the folder toward them, revealing the documents within, the signatures already in place, the terms already established, and the coordinator's expression shifted first, her professional composure giving way to a brief flicker of recognition as she scanned the top page, her eyes moving quickly, precisely, understanding forming in real time, while Ashley leaned forward slightly, her confidence tightening into something more focused, more alert, and Daniel remained still, his gaze moving between us, trying to piece together what was happening. And I rested my hands lightly on the table, not asserting, not pressing, simply present, allowing the moment to expand, to settle, to reveal itself fully, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, about placing the truth where it could no longer be adjusted or reinterpreted. And as the silence stretched, filled with the quiet weight of realization, I understood that everything had shifted, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in the only way that mattered. The balance of control had already moved, and they were only just beginning to see it. The silence in the room did not break immediately, it stretched, settled, deepened in a way that made every small movement feel louder than it should have been, and I watched as the coordinator's eyes moved across the first page again, slower this time, more deliberate, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to careful awareness, the kind that comes when something unexpected enters a space designed for routine. And Ashley leaned in further, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, her posture no longer relaxed but held in a quiet tension she had not intended to reveal. "What is this?" she asked, her voice still controlled, but thinner now, less certain than before, and I turned my gaze toward her, not sharply, not confrontationally, simply meeting her question with the same calm I had carried from the beginning. "It is a trust agreement," I said, my tone even, measured, as if I were explaining something entirely ordinary, and Daniel shifted in his seat beside her, his brow tightening slightly as he leaned forward to look more closely, his eyes moving quickly over the document, searching for something familiar, something that would return this moment to the version he understood, but there was nothing there for him to recognize, nothing that fit into the plan they had brought with them, and the coordinator cleared her throat softly, a subtle acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond the standard process she was accustomed to guiding. "This appears to be already executed," she said carefully, her voice professional but cautious, and I nodded once. "Yes," I replied, my hand still resting lightly on the table, unmoving, steady. "It was completed earlier this week," and I allowed that to settle, not rushing to fill the space, not explaining further than necessary, because the documents themselves were clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And Ashley's expression tightened just slightly, not enough for someone who did not know her to notice, but enough for me to see the shift from confidence to calculation, the moment where she began reassessing, adjusting, trying to understand where control had slipped. "But we were just discussing," she began, her voice catching for the briefest second before she regained it. "We were planning to make sure everything was taken care of," and I inclined my head gently, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its implication. "And it has been," I said, my voice calm, almost reassuring, and Daniel looked up then, his gaze meeting mine directly for the first time since we had arrived, and there was something different in his eyes now, not avoidance, not uncertainty, but confusion, a quiet realization that something had shifted beyond his understanding. "Mom," he said slowly, as if choosing each word carefully, "what does this mean?" And I held his gaze. Not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained in emotional terms. "It means that my home, my accounts, and everything associated with them are now managed under this trust," I said, each word deliberate, steady, "and it means that no decisions regarding my living arrangements can be made without my explicit consent," and I watched as that settled over them, the simplicity of the statement carrying a weight far heavier than its tone suggested. Ashley straightened slightly, her composure returning in a different form now, sharper, more focused. "We were not trying to make decisions without you," she said, her voice measured, controlled, but I did not respond to that, because this was not about debating intention, it was about acknowledging reality, and the reality was already written, already signed, already in place. The coordinator shifted in her seat, her attention now fully on the documents I had provided, her role in this moment changing from facilitator to observer. "In that case," she said carefully, "any further steps would need to align with the terms outlined here," and her words, though neutral, carried a finality that could not be softened, and I nodded once more, not to her, but to the moment itself, the quiet confirmation that everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to, and I reached forward, closing the folder gently, my movements unhurried, controlled, and I stood, smoothing my dress as I did, the same simple gesture I had made so many times before, but this time it carried something different, not habit, but completion. And I picked up my bag, placing the folder securely inside, and turned toward the door. Not abruptly, not dramatically, simply moving forward as I had intended from the beginning. "Shall we go?" I said softly, not as a question that required agreement, but as a statement of direction, and for a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the space between what they had expected and what had actually occurred, and then Daniel stood slowly, his movements uncertain now, his earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something more aware, while Ashley remained seated just a second longer, her gaze fixed on the closed folder as if she could still change something by understanding it differently, but there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to adjust, and as we walked out of the office, back through the carefully designed hallways, past the smiling residents and neatly arranged spaces, I felt no sense of victory, no surge of emotion, just the same steady clarity that had guided me from the beginning, because this was never about winning, it was about standing exactly where I belonged, with the certainty that no one else would decide that for me again. The drive back was quieter than the one that had brought us there, not because anything had been said that needed silence, but because there was nothing left to assume, nothing left to guide the conversation in the direction they had originally planned, and I sat in the back seat once again, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze directed out the window as the familiar streets began to reappear, each turn bringing us closer to the house that had never truly stopped being mine, despite everything they had quietly tried to reshape around it, and I could feel the shift in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, Ashley no longer pointing out buildings or filling the silence with casual remarks, Daniel driving with a focus that seemed more inward than outward, his earlier certainty replaced by something more careful, more aware, and for the first time in a long while, I was not the one adjusting to them, they were adjusting to me, even if they did not fully understand it yet, and when we pulled into the driveway, the engine turned off with a soft finality that echoed the moment we had just left behind, and I stepped out of the car without waiting, not out of impatience, but because I no longer needed to follow their pace. I walked toward the front door, unlocking it with the same key I had always used, the small, ordinary motion carrying a quiet weight that neither of them commented on, and as I stepped inside, the house greeted me in the same way it always had, unchanged, steady, familiar, but now it felt different in a way that could not be seen, only understood, and I set my bag down on the table, placing it in the same spot where the brochure had once rested, the same table where everything had first been presented to me as if it were already decided, and I turned back toward them as they entered behind me, their movements slower now, more measured, as if they were stepping into a space they no longer fully controlled, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable, not tense, but filled with something new, something that had not existed before. And Daniel finally cleared his throat, his voice quieter than usual. "Mom," he began, stopping just long enough to search for the right words, the ones that would restore the balance he had lost without realizing it. "We were just trying to help," and I looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy he had once been, the one who had trusted me without question, the one who had never imagined a moment like this, and I felt no anger toward him, no resentment, only a clear understanding of how easily things change when you stop paying attention. "I know," I said gently, my voice steady, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply true, and Ashley shifted slightly beside him, her expression composed once more, but different now, less certain, more watchful. "We thought it would be easier this way," she added, her tone careful, as if each word needed to be placed exactly right. And I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, because ease for one person is not always the same as dignity for another, and I walked slowly to the chair at the head of the table, taking my seat with the same quiet composure I had carried from the beginning, my hands resting lightly on the surface, and I let the silence return, not as something to avoid, but as something to allow, because sometimes silence says more than explanation ever could, and after a moment, I spoke again, not loudly, not with emphasis, just clearly. "I will make my own decisions about where I live," I said, each word simple, direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and I saw the shift in their expressions, not resistance, not argument, but recognition, the realization that the conversation they thought they were having had already ended somewhere along the way, replaced by something they had not anticipated, and Daniel nodded slowly, as if absorbing the meaning of what had just been said, not just the words, but the position behind them, and Ashley remained still, her gaze steady, her thoughts moving behind her eyes in a way that told me she was already recalculating, already adjusting to a reality that no longer fit the structure she had built, and I allowed them that moment, that space to understand, because this was not about forcing anything, it was about making something clear enough that it could not be ignored, and as the afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room, I felt a quiet sense of completion settle in, not because something had ended, but because something had finally been established, something that had always been there but had gone unspoken for too long, and I reached for my bag once more, opening it just enough to feel the edge of the folder inside, not to show it, not to reference it again, but to remind myself of what had already been done, what no longer needed to be defended or explained, and I looked at them one last time, not with judgment, not with distance, but with a calm certainty that did not require their approval, and I understood then that whatever came next would be different, not because they had changed, but because I had, and that difference would shape everything moving forward in ways they would only begin to understand over time, because the truth is, they thought they were deciding where I would go, but in the end, I was the one who decided exactly where I stood.